Chapter 4, It's Been 1,000 Years. Platinum Calendar, 1886. The moment he heard the year, Zhou Mu couldn't help but gasp. He clearly remembered that the ending of Doomsday Watchers was in the 878th year of the Platinum Calendar. In other words, he had transmigrated 1008 years into the future. 1,000 years was enough for humans to evolve from cold arms to strategic arms for the practice of deterrence in the real world. How much can a world change in 1,000 years? How many of my companions are still alive? Do the traces I left behind still exist? What has this world become? And my strength, even if he was invincible across the continent 1,000 years ago, what level was he at now? When Zhou Mu thought of this, he couldn't help but turn his gaze to withering cold in his hand. At the very least, he won his first battle after transmigrating very easily. It was so easy that it exceeded his best expectations. As the first battle he encountered after transmigrating, Zhou Mu made ample preparations. He first used 2 support spells Featherfall and Echo. While hiding his footsteps, he created fake footsteps in another direction to draw the enemy's attention. Then, he used the air and restraint combo Float and Glacier Spike. This set of crowd control techniques nailed the 2 subdemons as though they were practice targets. He even planned on carrying out the finishing touches with 3 single-target damage spells with different stats: Wind Impact, Spear Flame Purification, and Void Thunderstorm. In the end, just the damage from Glacier Spike killed the other party. In-game, the 2 subdemons were at most level 30. In the end, it seemed like he was a little too cautious. But the problem was, could 2 subdemons really represent the entire level of this world 1,000 years later? He had to find more qualified experimental subjects to make the determination. Where are we going? Just as Zhou Mu was in thought, the girl named Liliana behind him suddenly asked. They had already walked out of Twilight Fortress. It was almost noon, and the dazzling sunlight coated the ancient fortress with a layer of gold. The corrosion of 1,000 years had left this once indestructible fortress in ruins. Nearly a third of the building had collapsed into ruins, and lush vines had crawled up the building walls. From afar, it was impossible to tell the difference between the surrounding forest and the fortress. He never expected the fortress that once commanded the Allied forces across the continent to launch an expedition to the Moon Realm to be in such an abandoned state. Go deep into the Grief Mountains. There's a place called the Scar of Sorrow. The 2 subdemons from before probably escaped from there. I have to eliminate the source. Zhou Mu looked back at Twilight Fortress with regret as he replied. What's the source? Liliana asked. Lunar monster, Zhou Mu replied succinctly. What's a lunar monster? Zhou Mu, who was originally a little distracted, looked at Liliana in surprise. In an era 1,000 years later, does she not even know what a lunar monster was? As the largest antagonist faction in Doomsday Watchers, an existence that had almost destroyed the world, Zhou Mu wasn't sure if this was good news or bad news. Then, you should at least know what the Moon Realm is, right? Liliana nodded. I've learned from Introduction to Theology that the Moon Realm is an illusory reflection created by the Void Sovereigns because they are jealous of the beauty of the Holy Spirit's creation and want to imitate it. They block most of the light at night, turning it into a void that fills the stars and a demon realm that hangs high in the sky, but these should just be myths and legends. Zhou Mu sighed. No, that's too general. In fact, that's not the case at all. The Moon Realm is essentially an upper plane that reflects thoughts. It's filled with all kinds of monsters born from extreme emotions and thoughts, and the so-called Void Sovereigns are the strongest existences among those monsters. Zhou Mu ignored Liliana's blank expression and continued. As for subdemons, they are fragments peeled off from the main bodies of powerful lunar monsters. It's precisely because of this that they definitely won't appear alone. Lunar monsters are void existences to begin with, and they need to be anchored by obsession in career to obtain a form from the void. It's even more so for subdemons that are fragments of lunar monsters. Zhou Mu recalled the game's lore. Therefore, powerful lunar monsters are definitely present wherever subdemons appear. Moreover, the more subdemons there are, the stronger the lunar monster will be, being their main body. Zhou Mu stopped and waited for the other party to digest the information. After a while, Liliana asked. Then, why are you so sure that it will be in that place called the Scar of Sorrow? This is because it's very difficult for lunar monsters to reach Career. They have to find a weak spot between Career and the Moon Realm. The Scar of Sorrow is one of the weakest spots between Career and the Moon Realm on the Vit continent. Therefore, as long as they are summoned on the right day and through the right ritual, they can be successfully summoned. A few days ago was the perfect date. A few days ago, Liliana asked curiously, didn't you say that today is the 24th or 25th of Twilight Moon? Liliana nodded. 22nd of the twilight moon is one of the moon realm void sovereigns. It's the summoning day for the Lady of Starvation, Camilla. This is the only day in a year when she can project her strength into career. Zhou Mu looked at Liliana and continued in a meaningful tone, Lady of Starvation is a generous void sovereign. On her summoning day, as long as someone offers enough sacrifices, they will basically receive a response. Liliana quickly understood what the other party meant. You're saying, someone wanted to kill my archaeological team by summoning a lunar monster. Why? Zhou Mu waved his hand. I can only say that it's a possibility, or perhaps it just happened. Of course, it's also possible that they weren't summoned from the Scar of Sorrow but came from somewhere else for other reasons. No, that won't happen. Zhou Mu's words reminded Liliana of the many times she had heard subdemons mention the name of the Lady of Starvation. But why? She only came here to finish her semester project. Who could she have provoked? We're here. Along the way, Liliana pondered over this question until Zhou Mu suddenly stopped. This is, shish. Zhou Mu turned around and gestured for Liliana to keep quiet. It looks like we aren't the first here. Chapter 5, Genius and Stumbling Demon. The altar consecrated the statue of the Lady of Starvation, Camilla. It was a sickly female statue made of colorful fungi. From afar, it looked like a rotten tumor or something else that made one uncomfortable. However, if one took a closer look, one could sense a certain sinister beauty in it. I lost contact with 2 pieces of debris in that ruin. The demon sitting under the altar and staring at the goddess statue suddenly spoke. It was a fat monster that resembled a mountain of flesh. It held a rusty dagger in its hand, and its head had twisted horns like dry branches. It was very tall, and it was much taller than ordinary male adults while still sitting. It was deformed, and its entire body was covered in strange sarcomas. Its skin was covered in festering and rotten marks. Do you want to take a look? The person who replied was a man in a gray cloak. He sat on the other side of the altar and held a lead-colored staff. His figure could be considered muscular, but he looked very thin when compared to the demon beside him. It's unnecessary. The best time for the anchoring ceremony is soon upon us. As long as this body's contract is completely anchored in the depths of your soul, my range of movement won't be limited by this altar. When that happens, whether this place is discovered by the others won't affect our subsequent actions, the monster with the rusty dagger replied in a dull voice. When the time comes, I can even use the people from the town at the foot of the mountain as a sacrifice before I leave. Don't be too ostentatious, psoriasis, the gray-robed man warned. Even if the churches in Blackwater Province are significantly weaker than the other places in the Empire, causing too much commotion will still attract the Sealed Temple's investigation. When that happens, it will affect our master's plan. Nobody benefits from it. Speaking of ostentatious, perhaps dissatisfied with the other party's attitude, the monster named Psoriasis narrowed its eyes. That can't be more ostentatious than selling the ruins map of the Grief Mountains to the Alpha University students, right? Although the ritual requires fresh sacrifices, aren't you afraid that the parents of one of the missing will hire a high-level adventurer team to search the mountains? Let me remind you, we tricked students from a noble institute of higher learning in the name of archaeology for them to be our sacrifices. Or are you still brooding over your expulsion from Alpha University back then, David Obies? The gray-robed man named David Obies only replied emotionlessly to the demon's provocation. Most of the archaeology students study healing and shadow rays spells, which are more compatible with the sacrificial blood you need. Moreover, they are stupider, easier to deceive, and easier to deal with than an adventurer team. That's all. Psoriasis grinned and was about to say something when his expression suddenly changed. The barrier I set up outside the Scar of Sorrow has been destroyed. Really? David's expression changed slightly. Psoriasis closed his eyes and sensed it before nodding. That's right. It was cracked from a single point, and it's collapsing now. Is the destruction of the barrier coming from that ruin? David asked in a deep voice. Yes, but the method the other party used is very primitive. He didn't use a cracking method and instead used pure magical power to destroy it. Hearing this, David's solemn expression eased a little. Using a mana stream to destroy the barrier meant that the other party was most likely a newbie, either because he didn't know how to conserve his precious mana or because he didn't know how to destroy the barrier. Was it a lost explorer? Or was it another archaeological team that fell for their ruse? However, no matter who it was, he wasn't letting down his guard. He had been preparing for this ceremony for over a year. He couldn't treat any seemingly trivial latent risks carelessly. Then, let's not wait for the ceremony's prime time. Let's begin the anchoring. Don't complicate matters. Psoriasis nodded its fat head in agreement. Then, it stood up and chanted an obscure moon realm incantation. Power spread as psoriasis chanted the incantation. The trees around the altar were snapped by an invisible force, scattering broken branches and leaves all over the ground. But if one observed carefully, one would discover that the brightly colored bacteria on the broken branches and leaves began to spread constantly. Thin strands of bacteria kept extending, and the area around the sickly life became extremely vibrant. Zhou Mu, who was observing the altar, felt someone tug at him. He turned his head and saw Liliana looking at him with a pale face. "Let's leave first before they discover us." "Why?" Zhou Mu asked in confusion. "I know who that gray-robed person is. He's not someone I can deal with alone. Let's go down the mountain and get help from the church." "So who's that person?" Zhou Mu was a little intrigued. David Obies was once a student of Blackwater Province's Offa University. At the age of 18, he obtained the title of LV7 in both the summoning and shadow rays fields. He was known as the genius at Offa University who had the highest chance of reaching the master domain or even the legendary domain in the past 50 years. "Is he considered your senior?" Liliana shook her head vigorously. "He was expelled from the university 2 years ago on suspicion of studying forbidden spells. Back then, the university contacted the Holy Spirit's Church and imprisoned him as a heretical mage. He eventually fought the executors who were deployed to arrest him. Half of the dormitory building was blasted to ruins, and the entire team of elite executors failed to retain him. The executors were mage assassins trained by the Holy Spirit's Church to deal with mage threats. To be able to fight an entire team of executors and escape, his strength was obvious. It said that the church sent people to search his house afterward. They found a large number of human organs used for primitive rituals in the basement, as well as the bones of many deformed monsters. At this point, Liliana was almost begging Zhou Mu. Ignoring the lunar monster beside him, a heretical mage with at least LV7 strength isn't an existence that we can deal with alone. Liliana's tone revealed sincerity, and Zhou Mu fell into thought over her words. Zhou Mu didn't know what strength LV7 was. Doomsday Watchers never had ratings for mages. It was probably a standard created by someone or an organization in the 1,000 years he was away. However, the master and legendary domains Liliana mentioned were indeed useful as a reference for evaluating a spell's strength in-game: apprentice, expert, master, legend, divine realm. Every spell had a word that indicated its rarity. Although rarity didn't imply greater strength for a game, this was the intention of the game's planning team. Not doing so was a problem for the game mechanics balancing team. If this was the analysis, the implication of having a chance of reaching master was that one could use expert-level spells. But could this be considered a genius? Therefore, compared to the gray-robed man whom Liliana treated as a formidable enemy, Zhou Mu's attention was more focused on the lunar monster who was chanting. From the other party's appearance, he could be considered an old acquaintance. Stumbling Demon. Zhou Mu had a deep impression of this monster. He remembered how much a pain this fellow was the time he raided the Lady of Starvation's Moon Realm dungeon, Lake of Entropy. Stumbling Demon was about LV60 to 80. Its design completely ignored the might of physical and magical attacks and focused on stacking its HP and HP regeneration speed. Of course, if it was only a tank with low attack and high defense, that wasn't the reason Zhou Mu would call it a pain. The most disgusting thing about the Stumbling Demon was that it would obtain a halo that constantly caused abnormal statuses after being injured. The more HP it lost, the stronger the halo's effect. It wasn't a threat, but it was fully capable of disgusting the player. Every time he encountered a large-scale encounter, any Stumbling Demon mixed into the enemy's lineup as a tank would significantly increase the battle's difficulty. But then again, if it was only summoned alone, the Stumbling Demon would only be a wooden stake used to measure the damage. A wooden stake used to test the damage dealt was what Zhou Mu needed the most. With this in mind, he pushed away the tree branches in front of him and walked out. Behind him, Liliana exclaimed in surprise at his actions. As for the Stumbling Demon and the gray-robed man named David, they looked over at the same time. The man's sudden actions threw Liliana's mind into chaos. For a moment, she couldn't figure out if she should run or blame the man for his suicidal behavior. However, Zhou Mu turned around and patted her shoulder. "Don't worry. Didn't I say that we should solve the source of the problem first?" His words reminded Liliana of her archaeological team and the people who had risked their lives to cover her escape. "But, oh, I almost forgot." As Zhou Mu spoke, he removed an ancient sunbird pendant from his neck and placed it in Liliana's hand. "The air here will turn nasty in a while. Put this on." Liliana subconsciously took the ancient pendant. The moment it came into contact with her skin, a warm current began to surge through her blood. An enchanted pendant. However, she had never heard of an enchanted pendant that had such an obvious effect without wearing it. By the time she came to her senses, the person was about 20 steps away from the altar. David Obies held his lead-colored staff and stood up. He looked back at Psoriasis, who was about to complete the ritual, and then at the white-haired, silver-eyed man. "Nice to meet you, unknown magic chanter," he said very politely. "Nice to meet you, the genius from that university and the stumbling demon behind you." Chapter 6, Spider Silk. David Obies frowned when he heard that. It wasn't due to the disdain in the other party's words, but because he had accurately described the lunar monster species behind him. 800 years ago, Great Sage Yates established the astral laws and divided magic into 9 levels and 13 series according to the distribution of the stars, completely reshaping the magic foundations of Vic. Moon realm spells that had always been in a gray area were excluded from the new system and became equivalent to a taboo. 800 years later, the astral laws system remained as firm as bedrock. The prohibition against moon realm magic had never been loosened. Across the continent, other than the ascetics sitting in demon burial and the living dead in the obliteration tower who were specially allowed to study the taboos from the moon realm, anyone who privately studied moon realm magic would be considered a heretic. This was the reason why he was expelled from Offa University back then. He was no exception even though he was the #1 genius in Offa University's past 50 years. The person in front of him could tell the species of psoriasis at a glance, which meant that he knew a little about moon realm magic. Therefore, was he also a heretical mage? Thoughts ran through David's mind before he probed, "May I know your name?" "I'm still not sure what my name means to this era, so I don't plan on revealing my name for the time being. Please forgive me." "What do you mean?" What did he mean by, "not sure what my name means to this era"? Did his name hold significance in this era? Although the other party's random answer left him at a loss, he originally asked for a name to give the other party the impression that he was willing to communicate. Since he couldn't figure it out, he might as well continue the conversation. "Then, Mr. Unknown, I have a suggestion. If you leave and pretend as though you didn't see anything, I guarantee that I won't hurt you and the lady hiding behind you." "Why?" The other party didn't look at him but at Psoriasis, who was going through the anchoring ritual. "You and I are both so-called heretics who have betrayed the astral laws. Since we're the same, it's naturally better to be friends than enemies." With that said, he fixated his gaze on the other party's expression, hoping to figure out something. He wasn't afraid of fighting the person in front of him. Even if Psoriasis couldn't attack yet, dealing with a mage who needed to rely on magical power to break through the barrier wasn't even a problem for him. However, Psoriasis had yet to complete the anchoring ritual. Its only connection to Carrere was the statue of the Lady of Starvation. If the other party was really a heretical mage who had a certain understanding of lunar monsters, his attacking the statue and severing the connection between Psoriasis and Carrere would put all his efforts over the past year in vain. Therefore, although David didn't plan on sparing the lives of these two, he had to act generous. It wouldn't be too late to kill these two after the ritual was over. After hearing his explanation, the person didn't say anything other than muttering the astral laws in a puzzled tone. He didn't even look away from the anchoring ceremony. "Sir, do you accept?" David couldn't help but feel a little anxious when he saw that the other party had been paying attention to the ritual and ignoring him, so he asked again. This time, his voice carried a slightly threatening tone. "Oh." The other party finally turned his gaze to him. "Both of you will die today." For a moment, David thought that the other party had guessed his plan and said this to expose the proposal he didn't plan on fulfilling. However, he quickly saw from the other party's eyes that the person was only expressing his intentions. The other party also didn't plan on letting him off. A comical feeling surged into his heart before turning into an unconcealable smile. "Ha ha 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 ha, a gutsy one you are." He laughed as he looked at the person, unable to hide his killing intent. "It puzzles me. Why aren't you willing to let yourself live longer? Why are you in such a hurry to die?" As David spoke, he slowly pointed the lead-colored staff in his hand at the person in front of him and then at the woman behind him. "Is it because of the lady behind you? Is she a survivor of the archaeological team from before? Or is it because you're too confident and think that just killing 1 or 2 subdemons and breaking through the barrier outside will—" "What barrier?" the other party suddenly asked, his voice filled with confusion. "The barrier you broke open with your mana stream before you came here. Don't you remember?" David sounded puzzled. Was there such a thing? The other party's expression was filled with confusion, and he didn't look like he was lying. This made David truly wary. Could it be that he wasn't the one who destroyed the barrier outside the Scar of Sorrow? Was it someone else? Was that person hiding nearby? Could this clown in front of him just be bait? David asked as he looked around warily. A barrier, the wall of shadows, was set up outside. If it wasn't cracked by you, how did you find your way in? After hearing his question, the other party finally revealed an enlightened expression. Oh, that thing, for anyone below LV 80, that thing, ahem, it doesn't affect anyone above a certain level of strength. I probably didn't notice and walked in. As for cracking it, it's probably thanks to the enchantment on my armor that automatically cracked the barrier. David couldn't digest the information in his words. What was the meaning of this? The barrier that could block magic chanters below LV 5 was cracked without him noticing. It sounded as simple as accidentally bumping into spiderwebs and destroying them while out. A bluff. It was definitely a bluff, David thought, but for some reason, he felt a chill down his spine. An extremely ridiculous thought appeared in his mind. The other party was very strong, far stronger than him. However, this should be impossible. He looked back at psoriasis's ritual that was coming to an end. In the ether domain, he could clearly sense a pale and dirty comet plummeting into the depths of his soul. This stumbling demon from the moon realm was about to appear and career through his soul anchor. He had to buy some more time. But this time, it wasn't because he was worried that the other party would destroy the altar and ruin his year of hard work. Instead, he wasn't sure if he could kill this unknown magic chanter in front of him alone. He needed to wait for psoriasis's ritual to be completed before teaming up. As a spawn of the Lady of Starvation, if the stumbling demon could successfully descend into career, even powerhouses at the master domain would have to avoid them. With this in mind, David planned on buying time through a conversation. Then, I want to ask again why you're here to be our enemy. It's because I know you're stalling. The white-haired, silver-eyed magic chanter interrupted him. It's fine if you want to buy time for the stumbling demon's anchoring ritual to be completed. I'm also waiting for it to be completed. The other party's words made David subconsciously take a step back. Without an anchor in the demon summoner's soul, it can only rely on that disgusting statue to appear. However, the commotion on my side might be a little loud later. If I accidentally shatter that statue, that stumbling demon will have to obediently scram back to the moon realm. This wasn't good. The man who wasn't willing to reveal his name said, as for why you asked me why I'm your enemy, although I know you only want to buy time, I think it's fine to give you an answer. David couldn't help but swallow when he saw the other party staring at him. Because you're a demon summoner and it's a lunar monster. The ruin not far away is the Twilight Fortress. Using that as a reason is sufficient. When the other party finished speaking, the pale and filthy comet in the ether domain happened to completely sink into the depths of David's soul. Violent magic powers began to surge in his blood. A strange feeling of mycelium growing in his body began to surface. The anchoring ceremony was completed. Psoriasis roared behind David, and the rusty dagger in his hand quickly became covered in dark green patterns. The distorted blobs of flesh on its body also began to proliferate and separate. When they fell to the ground, they squirmed and morphed. Long limbs and a huge head grew out of them, and finally, they turned into newborn subdemons. Thank you for reading on myboxnovel.com. Psoriasis walked forward and held the dagger that emitted a decaying aura. He looked down at the magic chanter and said in a deep voice, "Shameless worm, tell me, how do you wish to die?"